Hi, I'm Dr. Rasheem. I'm an independent scholar and social scientist researcher. My scholarship encourages a critical examination of society and culture through the lens of race, class, gender, sexual orientation. As an instructor, I am deeply committed to helping students gain deeper insight into an interdisciplinary, cross-cultural, intersectional approach to the academic study of marginalized populations. Today, I'm very much interested in talking to you about understanding the impact of institutional racism. Structural racism impacts the socio-emotional well-being of Black, Indigenous people of color. There are real stressors, real feelings, real things connected to alienation that contribute to depression and anxiety that are a result of institutional racism. In discussing the impact of structural racism on people of color, it's important to start the conversation with emotional labor. Emotional labor is a term coined by sociologist Arlie Hochschild in her famous book, The Managed Heart. So one of the things that's identified is that emotional labor occurs when employees introduce or suppress emotions in order to portray themselves in a certain light. She gives two important aspects that are related to the management of one's emotions. They're not necessarily related to work, but in this context, we're going to use them as related to work because we're talking about an institution. So one is deep acting. Deep acting is where a person works to place his or her private emotions aside into one that is in line with what is socially accepted in that given situation. So, for example, if a boss, let's say if it's a woman, a boss comes to a woman and says something like, I really think that you'd be happier if you wore your skirt shorter or something like that. Now, in that particular environment, that woman might take an assessment of what might happen if she acts in resistance to her boss. And she might take those emotions and she might set those aside and do what she might believe is socially acceptable to him or to that environment in that situation. And her response may be something along the lines of giggling because he feels like he has made a joke, right? So that is to say that deep acting doesn't change how you privately feel. It just changes how you publicly perform. Another aspect that she points out is surface acting. Surface acting is where a person puts on a face essentially and places his or her outward emotions and appearance in line again with what is socially expected or acceptable in certain situations. In other words, surface acting changes your public display of emotion. Another person that articulates this is Melissa Harris Perry. She actually references in her book, Sister Citizen, there's a chapter called The Crooked Room. It's actually not her direct study, but she brings it up and she places it in the context of Black women and their performance, right, in larger context of society. So in this study, there's this crooked room. And what happens is the social scientists bring people into the room and they ask them to line themselves up in upright position. Some people upon entering the room is crooked, decide that they realize that there's something happening. And so they line themselves up then with the room and consider that in a straight up alignment. Some others see that disalignment and decide to go to the other extreme. What it articulates in that particular scenario is the impact of the environment on deciding how you are going to specifically respond. She highlights in her work the ways in which Black women might show up and perform in a particular way, doing some of this deep acting or surface acting. And sometimes that is the internalizing and accepting that the room is crooked and going along with all of the ways in which is crooked. So you may perform in that way. And then there's other ways in which it's resisted and you perform in something in a manner that is very directly in opposition to who you probably even are. Another way in which it shows up in the workplace or in other institutional environments, the impact of institutional racism is what I would call the mammification of Black women in the workplace. So again, scholars like Melissa Harris Perry, Dr. Kimberly Wallace Sanders has done tons of research. Those are just two people who have done tons of research on the mammification of Black women. The mammification gets its origin from the mammy. Now, the mammy in historical context, she is nurturing, she is selfless, she does not need anything for herself. She works to take care of your children, even at the risk of neglecting her own. And there's this unspoken requirement that the mammy is asexual. Why is the mammy useful? The mammy is useful because, well, for all of those reasons. She's nurturing, she's selfless, she doesn't need anything for herself. You can overwork her. She will neglect her own interests and projects for the sake of yours, and also coddle and take care of you in the process. And things like you would never see a person who is mammified, or a person who has accepted. You would probably never see them with a partner, just simply because that role might render her less desirable in the eyes of the institution. Another thing that comes up in the institutionalization of or in institutional racism and the impact that it has on people of color are racial battle fatigue. Now, this is a term that was coined in 2003. It describes the stress response from being a racially oppressed group member in society on a historically white campus. That's where the site of this research came into being. It was introduced by William A. Smith. Psychological symptoms can include, but were not limited to, depression, chronic anxiety, anger, frustration, sleep deprivation, disappointment, resentment, intrusive thoughts, avoidance, helplessness, and fear. To further drive the point of racial battle fatigue home and some of the other things around deep acting or surface acting, George L. Ingalls' biopsychosocial model could prove very helpful in identifying the social, emotional, and health-related illnesses connected to people of color experiencing racism. I think one of the things that's very important to get out of it and to take home is that racism enacted upon an oppressed group over a period of time within an institutional context has real impacts on their mental, emotional well-being, and leads to things that come up in racial battle fatigue, like anger, frustration, shock, resentment, emotional withdrawal. I think sometimes in different environments, we see that acted out. We see a person who is anxious or frustrated or depressed, and we don't connect their environment or the institutional racism to being contributing factors in that particular environment. The reason why I say that the biopsychosocial model is an interdisciplinary model is it looks at the interconnection between biology, psychology, social environment factors. The model specifically examines how these aspects play a role in topics ranging from health and disease models to human development. So as a further breakdown, what are some of the factors? One might ask, that would lead to having any sort of impact on a person of color that could be derived from institutional racism? Some of those factors are, again, some of the environmental factors are something as simple as access to healthy food, exposure to violence, inequitable allocation of resources, exposure to lead that was brought to light, for example, with Flint in 2012. Those are systemic environmental factors. And then some of the effects of structural racism or institutional racism are, again, alienation, depression, and anxiety. The compounded impact of institutional racism is not simply a structural one, it's not simply an economic one, which again is why that model would be so helpful in just understanding. So if a person were to want to explore those connections between environment and mental and social, that would be an excellent model to reference. It has all of these things. Racism, institutional racism, has real impacts on the social emotional well-being and quality of life for people of color and deserves further investigation. And I think an excellent tool to begin that is the biopsychological model of health.